will be analysing Philip Larkin's poem I Remember, I Remember. Poetry analysis, free resources and teacher hacks, please do check out thinklit.co.uk. Philip Larkin is a 20th century English poet, novelist and librarian whose work is known for its frank, stark and often bleakly pessimistic view of the world. Interestingly, Larkin was educated at home by his sister, Kitty, and his mother until the age of 8, and that may have an impact on this poem, I Remember, as we'll look later. In this poem, the speaker is on a train travelling up through England when he is surprised to arrive at a station in Coventry, where he was born. The rest of the poem, from stanza 1 onwards, is a memory poem, or rather non-memory poem, in which the speaker considers all of the features of his childhood that he didn't have. It's really a very negative look back at a life that he didn't lead. Larkin's poem takes its name and its starting ideas from a previous poem by Thomas Hood with the same name, I Remember, I Remember. Hood's poem is a very fond look back at childhood memories and views childhood as a pinnacle and a peak of happiness. Larkin's poem, however, looks back at things that didn't happen in a very bleak and negative way. I Remember by Philip Larkin. Coming up England by a different line, for once, early in the cold new year, we stopped and, watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates, "Why, Coventry!" I exclaimed. "I was born here." I leant far out and squinnied for a sign that this was still the town that had been mine so long, but found I wasn't clear which side was which. From where those cycle crates were standing, had we annually departed for all those family halls? A whistle went, things moved. I sat back, staring at my boots. "Was that," my friend smiled, "where you have your roots?" "No, only where my childhood was unspent," I wanted to retort. "Just where I started." By now I've got the whole place clearly charted. Our garden first, where I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat. And here we have that splendid family I never ran to when I got depressed. The boys all biceps and the girls all chest. Their comic Ford, their farm where I could be really myself. I'll show you, come to that. The bracken where I never trembling sat, determined to go through with it. Where she lay back and all became a burning mist. And in those offices, my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point, nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor, who didn't call and tell my father there before us had we the gift to see ahead. "You look as though you wish the place in hell," my friend said, "judging from your face." "Oh well, I suppose it's not the place's fault," I said. "Nothing, like something, happens anywhere." We see the poem is composed of 7 quintains, which quintain is a 5-line verse. And despite the regular verse structure, there's no consistent repeating pattern of rhyme. You can see in the letters that I've set out for you that there are repeated rhyming sounds, and sometimes we get rhyming couplets. So we see in stanza 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 and 7 that there are some rhyming couplets, but they're not in a consistent pattern. Perhaps this reflects the surprise with which the speaker feels he's arrived suddenly in Coventry without any warning. So let's go through stanza by stanza really quickly. You can pause the video at any time to take some notes and to look in more detail at some of the highlighted sections. First of all, we see that this is a different line, a different route to the one that the speaker normally takes. And we see in typical Larkin style that it's early in the morning in the cold new year, often seen as quite a bleak time, early January. And Larkin's approach here is to reflect in the early morning coldness, the sense of bitterness and negativity that the poem goes on to develop. The inclusive pronoun we tells us that the speaker is not alone. He's taking this journey on the train with a friend. And we see the exclamation mark and the verb exclaimed are used to highlight and draw attention to the direct speech at the end of the first stanza. He's shocked. Why Coventry? I exclaimed. I was born here. And we hear that the immediacy of the direct speech adding impact to that line. Larkin uses colloquial language to really ground this poem in everyday life and everyday memories and experiences, and also in its context of being very much a British or an English poem. Squinnied here means something similar to squinted and creates that very informal conversational style. The speaker is conflicted in this stanza. He's trying to balance the fact that Coventry is his birthplace and home place, where he lived for 18 years, against the fact that he can't even picture the city. He can't quite tell which side was which. The use of the possessive word mine is in inverted commas, suggesting that he maybe doesn't quite feel that the place is his. It doesn't feel like he belongs there. He mentions the cycle crates, which are a very ordinary object, very regular part of a train station, and he uses it as a question to ask, had we annually departed for those family halls? And the use of the question mark here draws our attention to this questioning tone and the negativity that's going to increase as the poem goes on. Immediately after the question, we've got an ellipsis, which creates a pause and allows the reader of the poem to really think about what has just been asked. The speaker feels that it's worth questioning, did I depart here for family holidays? And we're left with the impression that the answer was no, that there were no family holidays. And with the use of enjambment, straight from stanza 2 directly into stanza 3 without a pause, we continue this conversational tone. We get then a series of short phrases, all broken up with punctuation marks, including the caesura after things moved. I sat back. So we get these pauses in the middle of the line, which cause us to stop. And it's interesting to contrast the fact that the whistle blows and the train moves, compared to the lack of movement for the speaker. He sits back and stares and feels really quite lost in his thoughts compared to the movement that's all around him. In stanza 3, the speaker is addressed directly by his friend, his companion. Was that where you have your roots? And this adds a lovely dynamic layer to the poem where we get this sense of conversation. But interestingly, the speaker doesn't respond. He wants to reply, but he doesn't actually verbalise his response. All of the thoughts that follow in stanzas 4 and onwards are trapped inside the speaker's own mind, and they're not actually verbalised. Note the negative qualifiers here. We've got lots of no and on the unspent to suggest this negative tone and the cynicism that pervades the poem. In stanza 4, we see that the speaker's very much lost in his own thoughts here. He's dug down into an almost anger, which is highlighted by the use of the word first that we see in this in the second line. Our garden first, where I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat. The blinding theologies of flowers and fruits is a romanticised description of a child who explores the garden and spends time playing outside, which is very typical of a normal childhood experience, but Larkin here feels, the speaker feels, it's not necessarily Larkin, although I think we can draw the line of comparison. He feels that he didn't spend his childhood like that. And the reference to the old hat is a reference to older family members, suggesting that Larkin's childhood was really quite isolated. The speaker's anger is intensified by the signpost of first, which suggests that he's about to launch into a long list of grievances. Anger also seems to be foremost in his mind when he thinks about that splendid family from whom he did not seek comfort. And again we see enjambment from stanza 4 directly into stanza 5. He says, and here we have that splendid family I never ran to when I got depressed. In his mind, this family who could have lived nearby would have had these beautiful, attractive children who he could have played with. The boys all biceps and the girls all chest. This idealised appearance of fictional friends suggests the speaker's own insecurities about himself, that he didn't look the way that they looked. The inverted commas around where I could be really myself highlight the irony and the bitterness with which the speaker looks back. Perhaps he felt there was no place that he could be really himself. I'll show you, come to that. In this line we see the speaker gaining momentum in his inner monologue here. His anger seems to be building, and the caesura, along with the conversational utterance, come to that, suggests he's really getting into a bit of an angry rant here. By now, by stanza 6, the speaker's entirely lost in his own thoughts. He has created in his mind this romantic novel scene or an experience of a romantic poet, determined to go through with it, where she lay back and all became a burning mist. He imagines himself as someone who might have lost their virginity in the hay, all pleasure and fun, and yet that didn't happen to him. So all qualified by the negative, where I did not, in the previous stanza. Again, another thing that he didn't do or didn't have is that his doggerel, his comic poetry, was not read by a family friend, who no one gave him a leg up in the world of work or the world of academia. He talks with some bitterness about having to do this all himself. Again, one of the most striking features of the stanza is the negative vocabulary. And as we approach the end of the poem, we see the speaker's thoughts are interrupted by his friend. So his friend says, "You look as though you wish the place in hell, judging from your face." And it's clear that the speaker's his anger at the place at Coventry and his anger at his own childhood is written all over his face so that his friend can see it. It's interesting that the speaker hasn't replied yet. So we're in stanza 7 before the listener in the poem, the friend, gets a reply to his earlier question. And instead of talking openly about these negative experiences, the speaker simply says, "Oh well, I suppose it's not the place's fault. Nothing like something happens anywhere." So instead of being honest and opening up to his friend, we see the speaker's thoughts stay trapped inside his own mind, and instead he gives a very simplistic reply, that it wasn't the fault of Coventry. His childhood would have been as bleak or as negative in any city, which is really a very depressing end to this poem. The isolated final line adds to that bleakness, the finality and pessimism with which the speaker responds to his friend. We see that punctuated by the caesura and the negative opening of that line, nothing. And that's where we're left with this sense of bleakness and negativity. Larkin's poetry often takes this tone, and we're left with the feeling that life really was quite bleak for him. Thank you very much for listening. Please do check out the website